The office smelled like old leather and the kind of money that had already been spent. Brandon Walker sat in a chair worth more than the entire contents of the duffel bag at his feet, which held everything he owned in the world. 18 years old as of yesterday, officially aged out of the state's care, and now sitting across from a man who looked like he'd been practicing law since before electricity was invented. Ronald Pierce had thin white hair and glasses that made his pale eyes look twice their actual size. The mahogany desk between them could have fit 3 foster kids sleeping head to foot. Not that Brandon would mention that out loud. Linda Patterson, his social worker for the last 6 months, sat in the chair beside him. She'd called this a formality, which in Brandon's experience meant something that wasted everyone's time but had to be done anyway. Pierce cleared his throat with a sound like gravel shifting in a tin can. He slid a thin manila folder across the polished wood. The estate of Kenneth Morrison amounts to $2,300 after outstanding debts are settled. Brandon felt nothing. He hadn't seen his grandfather in 8 years. Kenneth Morrison was a name on a file, a ghost who'd sent him into the system at age 10 and never looked back. Not a letter, not a birthday card, not a single phone call in 8 years of group homes and emergency placements and learning how to sleep light because you never knew who'd go through your stuff in the night. $2,300 felt about right for what that relationship had been worth. Pierce reached into a drawer and withdrew a yellowed manila envelope larger than the first, sealed with a thick wax stamp that looked like it belonged in a museum. He slid it across the desk, and it stopped just short of Brandon's hands, forcing him to lean forward to claim it. The name on the front was written in spidery handwriting. He didn't recognize Brandon Walker. He was very specific about this. The envelope was to be given to you only on your 18th birthday, only after the will was read. Brandon picked it up. Heavy, lumpy. Inside, he could feel the hard shape of a key and the stiff edges of folded paper. "What is it?" Pierce adjusted his glasses, and for just a second, something flickered behind those magnified eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or concern. "It is the deed to a parcel of land in northern Oregon, approximately 5 acres, and the key, I presume, to whatever is on it." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "To be frank, Brandon, the land is worthless. It's undeveloped rocky miles from any serviceable road. The county values it at next to nothing for tax purposes. It was his only asset the creditors couldn't or wouldn't touch." Brandon's hand tightened on the envelope. Worthless land and pocket change. A final message from a man who'd thrown him away like trash. He should walk out right now, cash the check, find the cheapest motel in Portland, and figure out what came next. But something stopped him. "Is there anything else?" Pierce hesitated. The pause was tiny, barely a heartbeat, but in the pressurized silence of that office, it landed like a gunshot. "Your grandfather was a private man. He made choices that were difficult to understand. Whatever's out there, he wanted you to find it alone." The lawyer's voice dropped half an octave. "Be careful, Brandon. Some histories are better left undisturbed." Brandon stood. The leather chair sighed with relief as his weight left it. He tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of the donated suit jacket that pulled tight across his shoulders. "We'll set up the account transfer. My assistant will handle it." As Brandon turned toward the door, Pierce's voice caught him one last time. "Brandon." He looked back. The old lawyer's face was unreadable, professional neutral, but his eyes held something else entirely. "He wanted you to have this. He said it was the only thing of value he had left to give. The way Pierce emphasized the word value suggested he meant something beyond money. Brandon walked out into the gray Portland morning and didn't look back. The bus north was a 14-hour crawl through a landscape that bled from city to suburb to farmland to wilderness. Brandon watched it all slide past the rain-streaked window, feeling like a ghost haunting the margins of other people's lives. The bus was mostly empty. A few solitary travelers, lost in their phones or sleeping against the vibrating glass. He opened the envelope an hour into the ride, while the engine droned and the world outside turned green. Inside, an iron key, heavy and pitted with rust, that came off orange on his fingers. And a piece of paper, not a modern deed, but a hand-drawn map on thick, yellowed parchment. Someone had drawn a circle in red ink with an X in the center. Beside it, GPS coordinates in careful block letters. And below that, instructions, north face of the ridge. One key, one lock, and at the bottom in different ink added later, trust what you find. The rest doesn't matter anymore. Brandon stared at those words for a long time. Trust what you find. From a man who'd cut him loose without explanation, who'd spent 8 years in absolute silence while Brandon learned what it meant to be alone. What was there left to trust? But the map was real. The key was real. And for the first time since he was 10 years old, Brandon had a destination that belonged to him. The bus dropped him at a crossroads where a single yellow light blinked against the gathering dusk. Hemlock Creek consisted of a gas station, a diner with a flickering neon sign that said "Eat" in letters, missing the A, and a general store with a faded Coca-Cola logo painted on brick that had probably been red once but had faded to the color of old roses. Brandon went into the general store. A bell chimed above the door, thin and cheerful, in a way that made him want to leave immediately. But he needed supplies. The woman behind the counter looked up from a paperback with a shirtless man on the cover. She was maybe late 40s, with the kind of weathered face that came from hard years, not hard living. Her name tag said, Margaret. Help you find something? Brandon grabbed a basket and started pulling things off shelves. Heavy-duty flashlight, batteries, water bottles, protein bars, rain jacket, because the Oregon sky looked like it was about to open up. When he brought everything to the counter, Margaret rang it up with efficient clicks of an old register. Passing through, Brandon hesitated, then pulled out the map, looking for a piece of property out on Timber Ridge. Margaret's hand stopped moving. She looked at him, really looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. Which parcel? He showed her the map. She pulled reading glasses from her shirt pocket, squinted at the faded ink. Well, I'll be. That's the old Morrison place. She looked up at him, and her eyes were suddenly sharp, assessing. You're his grandson. You look just like him. Brandon didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Margaret's face softened, but not in a pitying way. In a way that suggested she understood more than he'd said. Your grandfather was a good man, kept to himself after everything, but he was good, stubborn as an oak stump, but fair. She pointed out the window. Timber Ridge Road is about 5 miles that way, turns to gravel after 2, then dirt. Property's at the end where the road stops. She bagged his purchases, but her hands moved slower now, like she was working up to something. Mr. Garrett wanted that land for years, tried everything. Kenneth wouldn't sell. The way she said the name Garrett made it sound like a curse word. Be careful up there. Brandon paid with some of the money Pierce had transferred that morning. As he shouldered his duffel, Margaret called after him, If you need anything, you come back here. You hear me? He nodded and stepped out into the dying light. The 5-mile walk felt like 50. The paved road gave way to gravel. that crunched under his feet like broken teeth. The sky darkened from gray to charcoal, and a cold drizzle started that made everything slick and treacherous. By the time the dirt track dissolved into a wall of overgrown vegetation, Brandon was soaked through despite the rain jacket. This was it, the end of the road, his grandfather's land. It wasn't welcoming. Blackberry bushes thick as barbed wire, ferns shoulder-high and dripping, young alder trees fighting for space under the shadow of Douglas, firs so tall Brandon had to crane his neck to see where they disappeared into the low clouds. No house, no cabin, no ruins of anything, just 5 acres of wilderness that the county had valued at almost nothing, and they'd been generous. For a long minute, Brandon stood in the rain and considered walking back to town, catching the first bus to anywhere, and using the $2,000 to disappear into a life that didn't include ghosts and mysteries and keys to nowhere. But he pulled out the map one more time, protected it from the rain under the edge of his jacket. North face of the ridge. He found the ridge easily enough, a spine of rock and earth that ran along the back of the property, rising maybe 30 feet above the surrounding forest. The north face was sheer, in places slick with moss, and rainwater studded with rocks that shifted under his weight when he tried to climb. Brandon spent 90 minutes scrambling along the base of that ridge, hands going raw, knees bruising through his jeans. The rain came down harder. His flashlight beam cut through the growing darkness in a cone that barely penetrated the downpour. He was about to give up to admit this was all a waste when his foot slipped on a patch of loose earth. He went down hard on one knee, and his weight sent a small avalanche of soil and rock tumbling down the slope. And there, where the dirt had been, was a corner of something that wasn't rock. Concrete. Brandon's heart hammered against his ribs so hard it hurt. He dropped to his knees and started digging with his bare hands, tearing at roots and moss and packed earth. His fingernails cracked. Blood mixed with mud. The cold didn't matter anymore. The rain didn't matter. He dug until he'd uncovered a rectangular concrete slab set flush into the hillside, maybe 3 feet by 3 feet. And in the center of it, recessed into the surface, was a heavy steel door. Its surface was covered in rust, the color of dried blood. There was no handle, no lock visible from the outside, just a single dark keyhole. Brandon's hand shook as he pulled the iron key from his pocket. He wiped mud from the keyhole and slid the key in. It fought him, grinding against rust and time, but then it sank in all the way. He grasped it with both hands and turned. Nothing happened. He put his weight into it, muscles straining. Then, with a deep groaning shudder that seemed to come from the center of the earth, something inside gave way. A clang echoed through the forest, startling crows from the trees. The sound was enormous, final, like something that had been locked for a very long time being released. A smell seeped from the edges of the door. Musty air, trapped time, things long forgotten. Brandon braced against the concrete and pulled. The door was immensely heavy, but it moved, scraping against its frame with a tortured screech. He managed to open it just wide enough to slip through. He switched on the flashlight, its beam cutting through absolute darkness, and stepped across the threshold. The door swung shut behind him with a boom that vibrated through his bones. Silence. Complete. Total. The kind of silence that made Brandon aware of his own heartbeat, his own breathing, the small, wet sounds of his rain-soaked clothes dripping onto concrete. For one terrible second, panic seized him. What if the door didn't open from the inside? What if this was a tomb, not a shelter? But he forced himself to take a slow breath and turn away from the door. The flashlight beam revealed steep concrete steps leading down into darkness. Brandon descended. The steps ended in a square room about 15 feet on each side. The beam of his flashlight swept across thick, concrete walls, steel I-beams reinforcing the ceiling. Along one wall, metal shelving held military surplus gas masks in canvas bags, sealed tins stamped with dates from the 1980s. Canvas canteens, jerry cans of water. A simple cot sat in one corner with a wool blanket folded so precisely the corners could cut glass. Next to it, a wooden table and a single chair. Everything was covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. This was a bunker, a fallout shelter, a place built to survive the end of the world. Brandon's confusion was so complete it felt like vertigo. His grandfather had been a carpenter. He'd built birdhouses and fixed sagging porches and smelled like sawdust and coffee. What kind of carpenter had a secret military bunker hidden in the side of a mountain? The flashlight beam found a green metal footlocker tucked under the cot. Brandon knelt beside it, fingers numb with cold, fumbling at the latches. They were stiff, but not locked. They sprang open with sharp snaps that echoed in the dead air. He lifted the heavy lid. The smell hit him first, cedar and mothballs, and beneath that faint but unmistakable, the scent of sawdust. Inside, neatly folded, were work clothes. A flannel shirt, blue and gray, checks faded from 1,000 washings, denim overalls with patches on the knees. Beneath them, a framed photograph. Brandon picked it up with hands that had started shaking again. He wiped dust from the glass. The photo showed a much younger version of himself, maybe 5 or 6 years old, sitting on a man's shoulders. Both of them were grinning at the camera, squinting against bright sunshine. The man had calloused hands gripping small ankles, and his face was weathered, but kind, creased with laugh lines. Brandon didn't remember the photo being taken, but he remembered the feeling. Being on top of the world, being safe, being loved. The memory hit him like a physical blow. For 8 years, he'd buried those feelings, had convinced himself they were lies, that the kindness had been fake, that the man who'd abandoned him had never cared at all. But this photo existed. These clothes existed, kept like relics, still smelling of the work the man had loved. At the bottom of the footlocker was a stack of envelopes tied together with twine. They were all addressed to him in that same spidery handwriting. But one envelope sat on top, separated from the others, with a single word written across it. First. Brandon's hands were shaking so badly he could barely untie the knot. He sat on the edge of the cot, and the springs creaked in the vast silence. The sound of the envelope tearing open was shockingly loud. He unfolded several sheets of crisp paper, every line filled with that tight, controlled script. He took a breath and began to read. My dearest Brandon, it started. If you're reading this, I am gone, and you are a man. I pray the world was kinder to you than I had to be. I know you have questions. I know you might hate me. You earned that right, but I need you to understand why. Brandon's eyes moved down the page, his heart pounding. I never wanted to send you away. You were my whole world. After your mother died, after losing Catherine, you were the only good thing left. But I had to. I had to cut you from my life to save it. The words blurred. Brandon blinked hard and kept reading. Before you were born, I made a mistake, a terrible one. I partnered with a man named Edward Garrett. We were supposed to be buying land for legitimate development here in Timber Ridge. But Garrett was different than I thought. He used intimidation, forged documents, threats. He forced families to sell for nothing, then flipped the properties for fortunes. When I found out the extent of it, I wanted out. I had evidence. Ledgers, recordings, documents that could have sent him to prison for 20 years. I threatened to go to the police. That was my mistake. Garrett didn't bluff. Your grandmother, Catherine, died in a car accident in November 1999. The police said brake failure. But I knew. I found the cut line myself after they released the car from impound. Clean slice, not wear. Someone had sabotaged it. Garrett's message was clear. Anyone I loved could be next. Brandon stopped reading. His chest felt tight like someone was squeezing his ribs. He made himself continue. You were 9 years old. I started seeing them. Black car outside your school. Man in the park watching you play. You told me about the strange man asked if you were in trouble. I lied and said it was nothing. It was everything. I couldn't go to the police. Garrett owned people, deputies, judges. I couldn't prove the threats without showing the evidence which would put you in more danger. As long as you were tied to me, you were leverage. You were a target. The only way to save you was to cut the tie. Make you disappear into the system where Garrett couldn't track you. A nameless file in a vast bureaucracy. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. October 12, 2008. I drove you to social services. You wore your blue jacket, the one your mother bought before she died. You asked me, did I do something wrong? Grandpa, I said, I can't take care of you anymore. The look in your eyes. That broke me, Brandon. I walked to my truck. I didn't look back because I couldn't. I drove 100 miles before I had to pull over. I cried until I couldn't breathe. For 8 years, I've lived with that moment. Every birthday, I've written you a letter I couldn't send. I had Ronald check on you, make sure you were safe in the system. You were. And that was all that mattered. By now, Garrett has probably forgotten. The threat has faded. You're 18, free, safe. This bunker is yours. There's money if you need it. But more important, there's truth. You can take what I've left you and walk away. Start fresh. Forget about me and forget about Edward Garrett. That's all I ever wanted for you. To be safe. To be free. I loved you, Brandon, every single day. Forgive me if you can. If you can't, I understand. Your grandfather, Kenneth. The letter fell from Brandon's hands. A single tear traced a hot path down his cheek, cutting through the grime and dried mud. Then another. Then he was sobbing great racking sounds that tore from somewhere deep in his chest and echoed off the concrete walls. The sound was ugly and raw. 8 years of pain, 8 years of believing he'd been thrown away because he wasn't worth keeping. 8 years of learning to trust no one, to expect nothing, to make himself small and invisible. All of it had been wrong. He hadn't been abandoned. He'd been protected. His grandfather had chosen a lifetime of guilt and loneliness rather than risk Brandon's life. Had sent him away, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. Brandon cried until he had nothing left, until he was just a hollow shell sitting on a cot in the darkness with a flashlight growing dimmer and the truth of his past laid bare. When the storm finally passed, he was left with something strange. Not peace exactly, but understanding. This bunker wasn't a tomb. It was a sanctuary, a place where one man had kept the truth safe until it could be told. Brandon sat in the silence for what felt like hours, the flashlight beam weakening. The letter lay on the floor where he'd dropped it. He picked it up again, hands steady now, and read the final paragraph he'd missed through his tears. "This bunker is yours now. There's money if you need it, but more important, there's truth." What truth? Brandon stood joint stiff from sitting and cold. He swept the flashlight around the room again. The shelves held only supplies. The walls were solid concrete. But Kenneth had said there was more. He started searching, checked behind the shelves, finding nothing but concrete and dust. Ran his hands along the walls, looking for seams or panels. Lifted the thin mattress on the cot, finding only rusted springs. Then he looked down at the floor. Under the cot where the footlocker had been, the concrete surface looked different. Not quite the same color. Brandon knelt and ran his fingers over it. There was a seam, hairline thin, but definitely there, forming a square about 2 feet on each side. He pushed on one edge. Nothing moved. He wedged the tip of the iron key into the crack and pried upward. The concrete shifted with a grating sound. It was a panel, a lid. He got his fingers underneath and lifted. It was heavy, but it came free. Beneath it was a dark cavity, and inside that cavity was a small steel document box. Brandon lifted it out. It was far heavier than it looked. He carried it to the table and set it down. The box wasn't locked, just waiting. He took a deep breath and opened it. The contents stole the air from his lungs. The top layer was cash. Stacks and stacks of $100 bills, bundled with simple rubber bands. Brandon didn't count it, but there had to be $30,000 or $40,000 there. Maybe more. Enough to disappear and start over anywhere in the country. But beneath the cash was something more valuable. A thick leather-bound ledger, its cover worn smooth from handling. And another envelope sealed with the same wax stamp. Brandon opened the second letter first. The handwriting was the same, but the tone was different. Not the voice of a grieving grandfather, the voice of a man preparing for war. "Brandon," it began, "if you found this, you haven't walked away. Part of me hoped you would. Part of me is proud you didn't. This money is for you to start over, disappear, be free. But this ledger is dangerous. 10 years of Edward Garrett's crimes, every illegal deal, every threat, every lie. I was his bookkeeper before I knew what he was. I documented everything. For years, Garrett has tried to acquire all the land on this ridge for a luxury resort. He's bullied and bankrupted every family here. My 5 acres are the last holdout. This worthless piece of rock is the linchpin in his multi-million-dollar plan. He thinks with me gone, the land will be his. He doesn't know about you." Brandon was still processing this when his phone rang. The sound was so alien in the absolute silence of the bunker that Brandon jumped, his heart hammering. The burner phone Linda Patterson had given him as a parting gift was ringing the tinny ringtone of violent intrusion. He fumbled it out of his pocket and answered. "Brandon, it's Ronald Pierce." The lawyer's voice was sharp, urgent, stripped of the dry, professional tone from this morning. "I'm glad I reached you. We have a problem, a serious one." Brandon's hand tightened on the phone. "What is it?" "Garrett Enterprises just filed an emergency foreclosure claim against your grandfather's property. They've produced a promissory note, supposedly signed by Kenneth, securing a debt of $180,000 against the land. They claim he defaulted. The note looks legitimate, but I know Kenneth would never have been that foolish. It has to be forged." Pierce's words came faster now. "The problem is they have a sympathetic ear with the county clerk. They've been granted an expedited hearing. We have 96 hours to formally respond, or the court will grant them the title. They're trying to steal it, Brandon, and they're doing it fast." Brandon looked down at the ledger in his hands, at the stacks of cash, at the letter that outlined exactly what Edward Garrett was. "Your grandfather's been dead since 2016, Pierce continued. 10 years. How did Garrett wait until now to file? Until you turned 18 and could inherit? The answer was obvious. Garrett had been watching, waiting, and now he was making his move. Brandon's voice was steady when he spoke, and it surprised him. "Mr. Pierce, I need to see you tonight. I don't care what time. I have something my grandfather left for me." He looked at the ledger, at Kenneth's meticulous handwriting, documenting a decade of crimes. Something that changes everything. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Pierce's voice came back low and careful. "Where are you in the bunker?" "On the property. I found it." Another pause. "Stay there. I'm coming to you. Give me the coordinates." Brandon read them off the map. Pierce said he'd be there in 3 hours. When the call ended, Brandon sat in the silence of his grandfather's sanctuary and felt something shift inside him. For 8 years he'd been surviving, keeping his head down, expecting nothing. That was over now. Kenneth had given him a choice. Take the money and run, or finish what had been started. Some fights don't end until someone finishes them. Brandon looked at the photo of himself at 5 years old, safe on his grandfather's shoulders. He looked at the letter, at the words, "I loved you every single day." The choice wasn't really a choice at all. He was Kenneth Morrison's grandson, and this land, this truth, this fight, it all belonged to him now. Pierce arrived at the coordinates 90 minutes later, then promised his sedan's headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Brandon had hiked back down to the road, the steel box and ledger wrapped in plastic garbage bags he'd found in the bunker, stuffed into his duffel alongside the cash. The weight of it all made his shoulders ache. The lawyer emerged from his car, looking 10 years older than he had that morning. His tie was gone, his shirt collar unbuttoned. He'd driven here at speeds that probably violated several laws. "Show me." Brandon led him up the trail he'd already walked 3 times, now his flashlight beam illuminating the path. Pierce followed without complaint, though his breathing grew labored as they climbed. When they reached the bunker entrance, the old man stared at the concrete slab and rusted steel door for a long moment. My God, Kenneth actually built this. He knew about it. Pierce's face was unreadable in the flashlight's harsh shadows. He told me once, years ago, that he had a contingency plan, a place to keep things safe. I thought he meant a safety deposit box. They descended into the bunker together. Pierce moved slowly, taking in every detail. The military surplus, the cot, the empty footlocker. When Brandon showed him where the hidden panel had been, Pierce knelt with difficulty and ran his fingers over the seam. Paranoid old carpenter, some people called him. Turns out paranoia is just preparation when the threats are real. Brandon spread the contents of the steel box on the wooden table. Pierce pulled on reading glasses and opened the ledger with hands that trembled slightly. He turned pages slowly, his breathing the only sound in that dead air. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Brandon stood and waited. Finally, Pierce closed the ledger and removed his glasses. When he looked at Brandon, his eyes were wet. "This is even more complete than I knew. Kenneth documented everything, every meeting, every transaction, every threat Garrett ever made." His voice dropped. "I need to tell you something. In 2009, Garrett came after me. He wanted help with fraudulent property transfers, needed a legitimate lawyer to make the paperwork look clean. When I refused, someone broke into my office a week later. They didn't take anything valuable, just my daughter's files, School records, medical information, her entire schedule. Pierce's jaw tightened. The message was clear enough. Kenneth gave me copies of some ledger pages afterward as insurance, but I was too afraid to use them. I've carried that cowardice for 17 years, watching Garrett destroy people while I did nothing. He looked down at the ledger. Your grandfather was braver than I was. He kept fighting the only way he could. Brandon pulled out the second letter and handed it to Pierce. The lawyer read it slowly, lips moving silently over certain passages. When he finished, he folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Kenneth predicted this. Look here. He opened the ledger to a page marked with a piece of ribbon, pointed to an entry dated March 2007. B.W. Insurance, $180,000 note, prepared unexecuted. Brandon Walker, your grandfather knew Garrett would eventually create a fake promissory note using your initials. He documented the plan before Garrett even executed it. So, we can prove it's forged. Pierce's expression was grim. Proving it and surviving the proof are different things. Garrett has owned this county for 20 years. Judges, police, county officials. The ledger names names, but those same people will fight like hell to keep it buried. Then what do? We go over their heads. State level. I have a contact at the Attorney General's office. Patricia Brennan, Public Corruption Unit. She's built her career on cases like this, but she'll need time to verify everything, and we only have 84 hours before the hearing. Pierce stood gathering the ledger and letters with careful hands. We drive to Portland tonight. I'll call Brennan from the road. You stay at my office building where there's security. If Garrett finds out you have this, he won't hesitate to make you disappear like he did your grandmother. Brandon thought about Margaret's warning, about the journalist whose office burned, about Kenneth living in fear for 8 years. Some fights you can't win by hiding, no, but you can't win them dead either. They sealed everything back in the steel box and made the long hike down in silence. Brandon took one last look at the bunker entrance before Pierce helped him camouflage it again with moss and dirt. The door's location was burned into his memory now. He could find it again even in full darkness. The drive to Portland took 3 hours. Pierce made calls while Brandon sat in the passenger seat and watched Oregon slide past in the darkness. The lawyer's half of the conversations were terse and technical. Yes, documentation spanning 10 years, multiple victims, pattern of fraud and intimidation. How soon can you get here? They arrived at Pierce's office building at 1:30 in the morning. The lobby was empty, except for a security guard who waved them through. Pierce's office occupied the 8th floor, and he led Brandon to a conference room with a long table and walls of windows overlooking the sleeping city. Brennan will be here at 6. Get some rest if you can. But Pierce made no move to leave. Instead, he pulled the ledger from the steel box and spread it open under the harsh fluorescent lights. Brandon sat across from him. Kenneth used a simple code. Properties identified by GPS coordinates. People by initials plus last 4 digits of their social security number. Payments in a substitution cipher, but I helped him develop it so I can read it. He turned pages, translating as he went. Here, 1998. Garrett and Kenneth form partnership. Legitimate at first, or at least Kenneth believed it was. Here, February 1999, first indication of trouble. Kenneth notes Garrett pressured elderly couple to sell farm for half its value. Used threat of eminent domain that didn't exist. What did my grandfather do? Pierce flipped forward several pages. He documented it, started keeping detailed records. March through October 1999. Pattern escalates. Forged signatures, fake loan documents, intimidation. Kenneth gathered evidence, planned to go to police. Then November 12, 1999. Catherine Morrison, your grandmother. Pierce turned the ledger so Brandon could see the entry. Kenneth's handwriting was shakier here, the letters uneven. KM Final Solution, brake line cut, payment to investigator, $8,000. The words blurred. Brandon blinked hard. Pierce continued. After that, Kenneth stopped threatening to expose Garrett. He had you to protect by then. Your mother had just died. He kept documenting, but he went silent. Garrett must have thought he'd won, that Kenneth would never talk, until Kenneth sent me away, until he made you invisible. Then he could go back to building the case knowing you were safe. Pierce turned more pages, his finger tracking entries. From 2000 to 2008, Garrett acquired 38 properties through fraud. Kenneth documented every one, names of victims, amounts paid, methods used. It's meticulous. Can we prove all this? The ledger alone isn't enough. It's Kenneth's word against Garrett's, but we can use it as a roadmap. If we can find the victims, get them to testify, corroborate the entries with property records and bank statements. Pierce looked up. Then we have something powerful enough to bring Garrett down. The sun was rising over Portland when Patricia Brennan arrived. She was younger than Brandon expected, maybe 40, with dark hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She carried a leather briefcase that looked expensive and well used. Pierce made introductions. Brennan shook Brandon's hand with a grip that made it clear she judged people by their handshakes, and weak ones were not acceptable. Show me what you have. For the next 2 hours she reviewed everything, the ledger, the letters, the forged promissory note Garrett had filed with the court. She made notes in a leather-bound notebook, asked questions that were sharp and specific. How did Kenneth obtain financial records? Were the recordings made with Garrett's knowledge? Can you verify the handwriting? As Kenneth Pierce answered most of them. Brandon contributed where he could, though his knowledge was limited to what he'd discovered in the last 12 hours. Finally, Brennan sat back and removed her reading glasses. This is substantial, more than substantial. If we can corroborate even half of these entries, we're looking at RICO charges, conspiracy, wire fraud, potentially conspiracy to commit murder. Can you stop the foreclosure? Her expression was carefully neutral. That's civil court. I can't intervene directly. But if we can prove the note is fraudulent, during the hearing, the judge will dismiss it. And once Garrett realizes we have the ledger, he'll know federal charges are coming. She tapped the notebook. The problem is time. You have a hearing in 79 hours. I need witnesses, documentation, forensic analysis of the promissory note. And I need to do all of that without tipping off Garrett's people inside the county system. Brandon's chest tightened. So what do we do? Brennan's smile was sharp. We move fast, and we hope Garrett is so confident he doesn't see us coming. Day one became a blur of motion. Pierce drove Brandon to the county clerk's office where they pulled property records going back 20 years. Brandon sat at a table in the dusty records room and cross-referenced every entry in Kenneth's ledger against official documents. The patterns were undeniable. Properties sold under market value to shell companies, then resold weeks later for massive profits. The same shell companies appeared again and again, all registered to addresses that turned out to be vacant lots or businesses that no longer existed. By noon, they had documentation for 18 properties that matched ledger entries perfectly. Margaret was waiting for them when they returned to Hemlock Creek that afternoon. She'd closed the store early, the closed sign hanging crooked in the window. She led them to her small apartment above the shop where cardboard boxes lined the walls. I kept everything, every piece of paper from David's case. She pulled out files with trembling hands, loan documents claiming her husband owed $60,000 to a company called Cascade Holdings, a promissory note with David's signature, except Margaret had proof it was forged because David had been in the hospital with a broken hand when the note was supposedly signed. Medical records showing the dates, photos of the cast. The judge ruled against us anyway, said we should have caught the error sooner, that the property had already been transferred to a legitimate buyer and reversing it would harm innocent parties. Brandon looked at the signature on the note, then at the one on his own forged document. The handwriting was similar, but not identical. Different forger, probably, but the same pattern. Margaret wiped her eyes. David had a heart attack 3 months later. Stress, the doctor said. I think it was grief. Losing everything we'd built together, watching Garrett walk away with it. Her hands clenched. I'll testify. I don't care what it costs. That man has terrorized this town long enough. Pierce made careful notes. Brandon saw the way his jaw tightened when Margaret described the judge's ruling, the way his eyes hardened. Whatever guilt Pierce carried about not acting sooner was manifesting as cold determination now. They drove to Stephen Walsh's house as the sun began its descent toward the coastal mountains. Walsh lived alone in a small cabin outside Hemlock Creek, surrounded by trees and a garden that had gone wild. He answered the door with a shotgun in his hands, but when he saw Pierce, he lowered it. Ronald, been a long time. Stephen Walsh was in his 60s, weathered and lean, with the careful movements of someone who'd spent a career watching his back. He'd been a detective for 23 years, before retiring in 2005. He invited them in served coffee in chipped mugs and listened to Pierce explain why they'd come. Catherine Morrison. I knew that case was wrong the minute I saw it. He pulled out his own boxes from a closet. Inside were photocopies of reports, photographs, notes in his precise handwriting. November 1999. Single vehicle accident on Highway 26. Catherine Morrison's car went off the road, hit a tree. She died on impact. First responders called it tragic, but straightforward brake failure. He spread photos on the coffee table, close-ups of brake lines sheared cleanly through. That's not wear, that's deliberate. I documented it as suspicious circumstances requiring further investigation. My chief at the time was Walter Barnes. He shut me down, told me the family wanted closure, not a drawn-out investigation. He amended my report himself, changed suspicious to accidental brake failure. Stephen's expression was hard. Barnes retired 6 months later, bought a boat, paid cash. I asked him where the money came from. He told me to mind my own business. Brandon looked at the photos and felt his stomach turn. His grandmother, murdered because Kenneth had threatened to expose Garrett. Will you testify? Stephen didn't hesitate. I should have fought harder back then. I let Barnes intimidate me. I let a killer walk free. If I can fix that now, I will. But as they were leaving, Stephen caught Brandon's arm. You need to know what you're up against. Garrett has people everywhere. When that journalist started investigating him in 2019, asking questions about property deals, his office burned down a week later. Electrical fire, the report said. Except the building was only 5 years old, up to code, with brand new wiring. Brandon felt the weight of the steel box in his duffel, the ledger that could destroy Garrett or get them all killed. I know, we're being careful. Stephen's grip tightened. Careful isn't enough. Garrett doesn't just have money. He has reach. If he finds out you have Kenneth's evidence before you can use it. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They returned to Portland as darkness fell. Brennan had brought a forensic document examiner, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in detecting forgeries. Brandon watched as she examined the promissory note under magnification, tested the paper with chemical reagents, analyzed the signature with digital overlays. At midnight, she delivered her findings. The paper stock didn't exist until 2010. The watermark is inconsistent with what was available in 2007. The signature shows micro tremors consistent with tracing rather than natural handwriting. And the notary seal belongs to someone who didn't receive their license until 2009, 2 years after this document is supposedly dated. She looked up from her microscope. This is a forgery. I'd stake my professional reputation on it. Brennan made notes. Good enough for court, but we need more. If Garrett's lawyer argues this is just an error, that his client acted in good faith based on a document he believed was legitimate, we need to show pattern and intent. That's what the ledger does, yes, but we need living witnesses, people Garrett has hurt who are willing to speak. Margaret has agreed. So has Stephen Walsh. Brennan nodded. I need at least 2 more. Can you find them? Pierce pulled out his phone and started making calls. By 2 in the morning, they had commitments from 4 more victims. A farmer who'd lost his orchard in 2011. A widow whose husband's construction business had been bankrupted in 2013. 2 brothers who'd lost their family's logging operation in 2015. All of them had stories that matched entries in Kenneth's ledger. All of them were willing to testify. Brandon tried to sleep on a couch in Pierce's conference room, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept circling back to the ledger, to his grandmother's murder, to the 8 years Kenneth had spent in that bunker, maintaining his vigil. Every time Brandon closed his eyes, he saw the photo of himself at 5 years old, safe and smiling on his grandfather's shoulders. He saw the letters written every birthday kept in the darkness, because sending them would have put him in danger. What nobody told Brandon about courage was this: it's not about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing it anyway. Kenneth had been terrified every day for 8 years, but he'd made sure Brandon would be safe enough to fight back. At 3 in the morning, the building's security alarm shrieked through the silence. Brandon bolted upright, disoriented. Pierce appeared in the doorway, phone already to his ear, speaking rapidly to building security. Brennan emerged from an adjacent office where she'd been reviewing case law, her hair down but her eyes alert. The security guard's voice came through on speakerphone. 2 men tried to access the 8th floor. When the alarm triggered, they left. Got footage of them in the lobby. Want me to call police? Pierce and Brennan exchanged looks. No, not yet. Send me the footage. A minute later, Pierce's computer screen showed 2 men in dark suits standing at the elevator bank. The camera angle was poor, their faces mostly obscured, but one of them turned briefly toward the lens, and Brandon saw enough to know this was no coincidence. Garrett knows you're here. Brandon's throat was tight. How small towns talk. You asked about the Morrison property. Margaret mentioned you were looking into things. Someone put it together. Brennan closed her laptop. We need to move faster. If Garrett's willing to send people here, he's desperate. Which means he's dangerous. She looked at Brandon. Are you sure you want to see this through? You could take the cash from the bunker disappear. Let us handle Garrett through official channels. Brandon thought about Margaret crying over her dead husband's files, Stephen Walsh's guilt over not fighting harder, the 4 other victims who'd agreed to testify despite their fear. Kenneth sitting alone in the darkness, writing letters to a grandson who hated him documenting crimes so that someday justice might be possible, I'm sure. At 7 that morning, Margaret called. Her voice was shaking. Brandon, my store. Someone broke in last night. They didn't steal anything, just left a message. What kind of message? She swallowed hard. Note on the counter said, Tell the Walker kid to stop. Brandon's hands clenched into fists. Margaret, I'm so sorry. I brought this on you. Her voice strengthened. No, Garrett brought this on himself. I'm testifying. They can threaten all they want. An hour later, Stephen Walsh called. Someone had left an anonymous message on his home phone, short and direct. Drop the Catherine Morrison stuff or your son has an accident. Stephen's son lived in Seattle with his family, 3 kids under 10. I'm still testifying, but I moved my son's family to a hotel under fake names. Just until this is over. His voice was steady, but Brandon could hear the fear underneath. Brennan was already on the phone coordinating protection. State troopers for Margaret. Seattle PD for Walsh's family. Every move they made increased the risk that Garrett would realize how serious the threat was. But there was no choice now. The clock was ticking down to the hearing, and people were in danger. Brandon stood at the conference room window and looked out over Portland. The city was waking up people heading to work, living normal lives where the biggest threat was traffic or a difficult boss. He'd spent 18 years learning to keep his head down, to expect nothing, to survive by being invisible. That life was over. Day 2 and 3 blurred together. Pierce and Brennan prepared the legal strategy while Brandon helped coordinate witnesses. The farmer who'd lost his orchard was afraid to testify until Brandon showed him Kenneth's ledger entry predicting exactly how Garrett would steal his land 3 months before it happened. The widow broke down crying when she saw documentation proving her husband's signature had been forged, that he'd died believing he was a failure when really he'd been robbed. Each conversation was its own small wound. Each story of loss and intimidation added weight to what Brandon was carrying. But it also strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about keeping 5 acres of worthless land. It was about stopping a man who'd spent 20 years destroying lives for profit. On the 3rd night, alone in the conference room while Pierce slept and Brennan worked through case files in another office, Brandon pulled out the other letters from Kenneth's footlocker. He'd been avoiding them, but now he needed to know. The envelope marked age 11 held a single page. Brandon, you're 11 today. I drove past your school yesterday. I know I shouldn't have. You were playing basketball with other kids. You were laughing. That's all I needed to see. You're okay. That's enough. Age 15. You're 15, almost a man now. I wonder if you still think about me, or if you've forgotten. I hope you've forgotten. It would be easier for you. But I can't forget you. Not for 1 second. Age 17. One more year, and you're free. I'm fading fast. The doctor says months, maybe weeks, But I'll hold on. I need to know you made it to 18, that you're safe. That's all I need. Then I can rest." Kenneth had died just 3 weeks after Brandon's 18th birthday. He'd held on long enough to know his grandson had survived, had aged out of the system safe. Then he'd let go. Brandon sat in the darkness and understood something he hadn't before. Kenneth hadn't just protected him from Garrett. He'd protected him from grief, from knowledge, from the burden of knowing what sacrifices were being made. Kenneth had carried all of it alone so Brandon could have a chance at a normal life. The freedom to hate him had been the final gift. Morning of the 4th day arrived with gray skies and the smell of rain. Brandon showered in the executive bathroom, put on the suit Pierce had bought him 2 days ago, when they realized this might take longer than expected. In the mirror, he saw Kenneth's eyes looking back at him. Pierce appeared in the doorway, holding something small. "Your grandfather wore this every day." He handed Brandon a watch. Simple silver, the leather band worn soft from decades of use. "I kept it after he died. Thought you should have it now." Brandon strapped it on. The weight of it on his wrist felt right, like taking up a mantle. They arrived at the county courthouse at 8:30. A few reporters lingered near the entrance. Word had leaked somehow that this wasn't just a simple foreclosure hearing. Brennan walked past them without comment, her face professionally blank. Edward Garrett arrived 10 minutes later in a black town car. He emerged wearing a suit that cost more than Brandon had earned in his entire life. Silver-haired, distinguished, with the bearing of someone who'd never doubted his right to take whatever he wanted. 2 lawyers flanked him, carrying briefcases that probably held very expensive strategies for crushing an 18-year-old who didn't know better than to fight back. For just a moment, Garrett's eyes met Brandon's across the courthouse steps. The older man's expression didn't change, just a slight nod, the kind you'd give a stranger. No recognition of the lives destroyed, no acknowledgement of the murder, just cold assessment. Then he smiled, and Brandon felt ice slide down his spine. Inside the courtroom was smaller than Brandon expected. Wood paneling, high windows, rows of benches, mostly empty this early. Judge Patricia Vance presided, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and an expression that suggested she had no patience for anyone wasting her time. Pierce leaned close. "Vance is fair. Garrett tried to buy her in 2010. She reported him to the state bar. He's hated her ever since, but he couldn't get the case moved to a different judge." The gallery held more people than Brandon expected. Margaret sat in the front row, her face set. Stephen Walsh beside her, the other victims scattered throughout. And in the back, partially hidden, Brandon recognized faces from Hemlock Creek. People who'd lived under Garrett's shadow for decades, who'd come to see if justice was finally possible. At 8:55, one of Garrett's lawyers approached Pierce with an offer. "My client is willing to settle $100,000 for the property, cash today. Your client walks away, starts his life. Everyone's happy." Pierce's expression didn't change. "Tell your client we'll see him in court." The lawyer's smile was condescending. "Your funeral." At 9 o'clock, Judge Vance called the court to order. Case number 2026-CV-1847. Garrett Enterprises versus the estate of Kenneth Morrison, now represented by Brandon Walker as sole heir. Garrett's lead attorney stood, and the performance began. Brandon sat at the defense table, his grandfather's watch heavy on his wrist, and felt the weight of 8 years of silence, 20 years of crimes, and one man's determination to protect what he loved pressing down on his shoulders. The thing about bullies is they're used to people backing down. Garrett had terrorized a town for 2 decades, and no one had ever stood up to him in court. He thought Brandon was just another scared kid. He had no idea what Kenneth had left behind. Garrett's attorney was a man named James Reeves' expensive suit and practiced smile, the kind of lawyer who charged by the syllable. He stood and addressed the court with the ease of someone who'd won 100 cases just like this one. Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of unpaid debt. In September 2007, Kenneth Morrison borrowed $180,000 from my client's company Cascade Holdings to cover medical expenses. The loan was secured against his property in Timber Ridge. Mr. Morrison made 3 payments, then defaulted. For 18 years, my client has been patient. Now that Mr. Morrison has passed and the property has transferred to his heir, we're simply seeking what we're legally owed. He placed the promissory note on the evidence table with a flourish. The document is notarized, properly executed, and bears Mr. Morrison's signature. The total owed, including interest, now exceeds $340,000. Since the property value is insufficient to cover the debt, we're requesting full title transfer. Judge Vance examined the note through reading glasses, her expression revealing nothing. Mr. Pierce, what is your defense? Pierce stood, and Brandon saw the years fall away from him. This was what the man had been built for, what decades of practice had prepared him to do. Your Honor, that signature is forged. The note is fabricated, and we can prove not only that this document is fraudulent, but that it's part of a 20-year pattern of criminal activity designed to steal land from innocent people. Reeves was on his feet immediately. Objection, inflammatory and prejudicial. This is a civil foreclosure hearing, not a criminal trial. Defense is attempting to smear my client's reputation with baseless accusations. Judge Vance looked at Pierce over her glasses. Mr. Pierce, these are serious allegations. I trust you have evidence to support them. We do your honor. Substantial evidence? The judge nodded. Then proceed. But carefully, counselor. Pierce called his first witness. Dr. Sarah Chen took the stand, credentials recited into the record. 20 years of forensic document analysis. Expert witness in 43 federal cases. Published author on forgery detection techniques. She explained her findings in language precise enough for legal proceedings, but clear enough for anyone to understand. The paper stock hadn't existed in 2007. The watermark pattern was introduced by the manufacturer in 2010. The signature exhibited microtremors consistent with tracing rather than natural writing pressure. The notary seal belonged to someone who hadn't received their license until 2009. In my professional opinion, this document was created no earlier than 2010, 3 years after its purported date. It is without question a forgery. Reeves cross-examined with aggressive precision, but Dr. Chen didn't waver. She'd testified in federal court against cartel money laundering operations. One local attorney's bluster wasn't going to shake her. When she stepped down, Pierce presented property records, 18 cases over 20 years, all following the same pattern. Fake loans, forged documents, foreclosures executed with suspicious speed, properties sold to shell companies that disappeared weeks after acquiring the land. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to interested. Mr. Pierce, you're establishing a pattern, but pattern isn't proof of intent in this specific case. That's when Pierce placed Kenneth's ledger on the evidence table. The courtroom went silent. Your Honor, this is Kenneth Morrison's personal journal documenting his business relationship with Edward Garrett from 1998 until 2008. Kenneth was Mr. Garrett's bookkeeper before discovering the fraudulent nature of their partnership. Reeves shot to his feet. Hearsay. This journal could contain anything. There's no authentication, no chain of custody, no proof. Kenneth Morrison even wrote it. Pierce opened the ledger to a marked page. Your Honor, I can authenticate this journal. I helped Kenneth develop the coding system used throughout. I can also provide handwriting analysis comparing Kenneth's known writing samples to entries in this ledger. But more importantly, the ledger contains specific predictions about future events that later came true, including this exact foreclosure attempt. He pointed to the entry dated March 2007, BW Insurance, $180,000 note prepared unexecuted. Brandon Walker, Kenneth's grandson. Kenneth documented that Edward Garrett planned to create a fake promissory note for exactly $180,000 to be used if Kenneth ever became a problem. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Reeves, your client may wish to hear this. Garrett sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, but Brandon saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw had gone tight. Pierce called Margaret Hawkins to the stand. She walked to the witness box with her head high, but her hands shook as she swore the oath. She told her story in a voice that started quiet but grew stronger with each sentence. The forged loan documents, her husband David's fight to prove the signature was fake, the judge who ruled against them despite medical records showing David had a broken hand when the loan was supposedly signed, the heart attack that killed him 3 months later. This note Brandon Walker is being sued over looks exactly like the one used against my husband. Same company name, same format, same forgery. She pulled papers from her purse, hands no longer shaking. I kept everything, every document, because I knew someday someone would listen. Reeves tried to discredit her on cross-examination, suggested grief had clouded her memory, implied the cases were unrelated. But Margaret had her documents, her dates, her proof, and she had righteous anger that 20 years hadn't dimmed. When my husband died, I thought Garrett had won, that he'd keep stealing from people forever because no one was strong enough to stop him. But Brandon is strong enough, and I'm going to help him finish what his grandfather started. Pierce called 3 more victims over the next hour. Each told similar stories. Each had documentation matching entries in Kenneth's ledger. The pattern was undeniable, damning impossible to explain as coincidence. By 11 o'clock, the judge called a recess. Brandon stepped out into the courthouse hallway, his shirt soaked with sweat, despite the air conditioning. Margaret caught his arm. You're doing good. Kenneth would be proud. Stephen Walsh approached from the other direction, moving with the careful awareness of someone who'd spent a career watching for threats. Garrett's people are making calls. I recognize 2 of them from my days on the force. They're scared. Good. Let them be scared for once. When court reconvened at 1 o'clock, Pierce shifted strategy. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to present additional context relevant to this case, specifically regarding why Kenneth Morrison felt compelled to document Mr. Garrett's activities in such detail. The judge nodded, wary but allowing it. Stephen Walsh took the stand. He introduced himself as a retired detective, 23 years with the county sheriff's office. Then he described the investigation into Catherine Morrison's death in November 1999. The brake lines were cut. Clean slice, not wear. I documented it as suspicious circumstances requiring investigation. My superior, Chief Walter Barnes, changed my report to accidental brake failure without my knowledge. He produced his original report, the one he'd photocopied, before Barnes could destroy it. Photos of the brake line showed exactly what he'd described. I was told to drop it, that the family wanted closure. But families don't usually want closure when someone's been murdered. They want justice. Stephen's voice hardened. Chief Barnes retired 6 months later with unexplained wealth. Bought a boat, paid cash. I asked questions. Was told to mind my business or join the unemployment line. He looked directly at Garrett. I've regretted my silence for 27 years, but I'm not silent anymore. Pierce opened Kenneth's ledger to November 1999. The entry here reads, KM Final Solution, brake line cut payment to investigator $8,000. Catherine Morrison, $8,000 paid to someone to look the other way. He turned to another page. 6 months later, this entry, WB. Retirement bonus, $45,000. Walter Barnes, the police chief who shut down the investigation. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Vance's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Order Reeves was on his feet, face red. Your Honor, this is outrageous. Defense is accusing my client of murder based on a dead man's journal entries and conspiracy theories from a disgruntled ex-cop. This has nothing to do with the foreclosure case before us. But Pierce wasn't finished. It has everything to do with this case, Your Honor. Kenneth Morrison witnessed his wife's murder. He knew Edward Garrett was responsible, and he knew if he exposed Garrett, his grandson would be next. That's why he sent Brandon into the foster system. That's why he lived alone for 8 years, documenting crimes, but never reporting them. He was protecting a child from a killer. Brandon felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom. Margaret was crying silently. The other victims sat frozen. Even the bailiff had stopped moving. Pierce continued, and it's why he created this journal, because he knew someday Brandon would be old enough, safe enough to finish what he couldn't, to stand up to a man who's terrorized this county for 2 decades. Judge Vance's expression had gone from interested to deeply troubled. Mr. Pierce, are you suggesting this foreclosure is retaliation? I'm stating it as fact, Your Honor. Kenneth Morrison died in 2016, 10 years ago. Why would Garrett Enterprises wait until now to file? Because Brandon Walker just turned 18, just became old enough to inherit. Garrett waited for the exact moment when a scared kid might not know how to fight back. He placed another document on the evidence table, but Kenneth predicted it. This letter, written weeks before his death and left for Brandon to find, warns him explicitly about a fake promissory note. Kenneth knew Garrett would try this. He prepared his grandson to fight. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even Reeves seemed unsure how to counter this. Then Patricia Brennan stood from her seat in the gallery. Your Honor, if I may, I'm Patricia Brennan, State Attorney General's Office Public Corruption Unit. The judge's eyebrows rose. Ms. Brennan, this is unusual. I'm here as an observer, Your Honor, but given what's been presented, I feel obligated to inform the court that my office has opened a criminal investigation into Edward Garrett and Garrett Enterprises. Based on the evidence Mr. Pierce has presented today, we're pursuing federal RICO charges, wire fraud, and conspiracy. She looked directly at Garrett. We've corroborated 12 cases matching the pattern documented in Kenneth Morrison's journal. We have witness statements, we have forensic evidence, and we have probable cause to believe Mr. Garrett has engaged in a decades-long criminal enterprise. Garrett broke. He stood abruptly, chair-scraping loud against the courtroom floor. This is a witch hunt. That journal is fabricated by a paranoid old man who couldn't accept that he'd failed at business. His voice rose, control slipping. I've been a pillar of this community for 30 years. I've created jobs, developed land, brought prosperity to Judge Vance's gavel came down hard. Mr. Garrett, sit down and control yourself, or I will hold you in contempt. But Garrett was beyond hearing. He turned on Pierce, on Brandon Fury, finally breaking through the distinguished facade. Your grandfather was a thief. He tried to blackmail me, threatened to destroy my reputation with lies. I gave him chances, multiple chances, to walk away. He chose this. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for phones. The bailiff moved toward Garrett. Reeves grabbed his client's arm, trying to pull him back down, but Garrett shook him off. And you. He pointed at Brandon, and there was nothing civilized left in his expression. You should have taken the money when I offered. Should have walked away like a smart kid. Instead, you're playing hero with a dead man's delusions. Judge Vance stood, her voice cutting through the chaos. Mr. Garrett, you are in contempt of this court. Bailiff, restrain him. Two bailiffs approached. Garrett tried to leave the courtroom, but they caught him before he reached the aisle. He struggled, still shouting, You have no idea what you're dealing with. This isn't over. None of you understand what. The bailiff's hand on his shoulder stopped him. Ms. Brennan, the prosecutor stood again. Your Honor, given Mr. Garrett's outburst and the evidence presented, the state requests immediate detention pending our investigation. We believe he poses a flight risk and a potential danger to witnesses. Judge Vance didn't hesitate. Granted, Mr. Garrett, you are hereby ordered held without bail pending criminal proceedings. Bailiff, take him into custody. The courtroom watched as handcuffs were placed on Edward Garrett's wrists. His lawyers stood helpless, their expensive strategies useless against their client's self-destruction. As Garrett was led toward the side door, he passed Brandon's table. For just a moment, their eyes met. This isn't over, kid. Brandon's voice was steady when he replied, Yes, it is. The door closed behind Garrett with a finality that echoed through the silent courtroom. Judge Vance sat back down, took a moment to compose herself, then looked at the foreclosure petition on her desk. In light of the evidence presented, including expert testimony that the promissory note is fraudulent and testimony suggesting a pattern of similar fraud, I am dismissing the foreclosure petition with prejudice. The property remains with Brandon Walker. Her gavel came down one final time. Furthermore, I am referring this entire matter to the county prosecutor and the state attorney general for criminal investigation. Court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Pierce shielded Brandon with practiced efficiency. Brennan, running interference with terse statements. No comment at this time. Investigation ongoing. More information to follow. Margaret pushed through the crowd and hugged Brandon so hard his ribs protested. Stephen Walsh shook his hand, gripped his shoulder, didn't trust himself to speak. The other victims clustered around, tears and gratitude and relief, pouring out in a chaotic jumble of voices. Brandon stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed, exhausted, and felt something he hadn't expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just the quiet certainty that Kenneth could finally rest. The following weeks unfolded with the methodical precision of a federal investigation. Brennan's team executed search warrants on Garrett Enterprises, seizing computers and files that filled 3 cargo vans. Forensic accountants tracked shell companies through a maze of offshore accounts. A grand jury convened. Garrett was formally indicted on 43 counts: racketeering, wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, witness intimidation, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. His bail was denied. His assets were frozen. Garrett Enterprises dissolved overnight, employees scattering to find work elsewhere. The man who'd owned a county for 20 years sat in a jail cell and watched his empire collapse through the narrow window of a television tuned to local news. But the real justice came in the small moments. Margaret received a settlement check that let her buy back David's business property. She stood in the empty building and cried, then called a contractor to start renovations. The widow whose husband's construction company had been stolen got her family's land returned. The farmer replanted his orchard this time without debt hanging over him. 23 families filed civil suits. Most settled out of what remained of Garrett's accounts. Some would get their properties back. Others would get compensation that could never replace what they'd lost, but at least acknowledged the harm. Stephen Walsh's son moved his family back from Seattle. The threats had evaporated with Garrett's arrest. Stephen spent his days fishing and his evenings writing a detailed account of the investigation for the State Police Ethics Board. 3 deputies resigned rather than face questions. 2 judges took early retirement. The cancer Garrett had spread through the county was being cut out 1 corrupt official at a time. Brandon returned to Timber Ridge on a gray morning, 3 weeks after the hearing. He stood at the bunker entrance, now cleared and marked so he could find it easily, and descended into the concrete room that held his grandfather's secrets. He'd brought cleaning supplies, work gloves, a battery-powered lantern. For 6 hours he scrubbed and organized, transforming the space from a forgotten tomb into a memorial. He hung photographs on the concrete walls, Kenneth and Catherine on their wedding day, his mother, Angela, at her high school graduation, the photo of himself at 5 years old, safe on his grandfather's shoulders. He arranged Kenneth's tools on the shelves, the ones that had been stored in the corner beneath tarps, hammer and saw and plane handles worn smooth from decades of use. He kept the letters in the footlocker, but he read them all now, every birthday message, every expression of hope and guilt and love. On the wall above the cot, he carved words into the concrete with a chisel, working slowly and carefully, because this needed to be permanent. Here, truth was kept safe until it could set us free. Kenneth Morrison, 1940 to 2016. The work was meditative, exhausting, necessary. When he finally emerged into daylight, his shoulders ached, but his mind was clear. Margaret had helped him find a local carpenter, a man named Thomas Reed, who'd known Kenneth years ago. Reed agreed to take Brandon on as an apprentice, teaching him the trade Kenneth had loved. They started simple, measuring lumber, understanding grain patterns, how to read wood the way Kenneth had, seeing in rough timber the finished shape waiting inside. Brandon discovered he had an aptitude for it. His hands learned quickly. The smell of sawdust triggered memories he'd forgotten, good memories from before the system, when life had been safe and his grandfather had been just a kind man who built birdhouses. He used part of the money from the bunker to buy tools, supplies, plans for a small cabin. The rest went into an account he barely touched. He didn't need much. The land provided water from a spring. Solar panels powered essentials. The forest supplied firewood. He learned to live simply sustainably the way Kenneth had lived before fear drove him underground. By late summer, the cabin's frame stood where Kenneth's original house had been. Brandon had found the foundation buried under decades of growth, the concrete footings still solid. He rebuilt exactly where Kenneth had built, using some of the original timber that had been too good to rot even after all these years. Thomas Reed taught him how to notch logs, how to fit joints so tight they didn't need nails. Other townspeople stopped by to help. Margaret brought lunch on Saturdays. Stephen Walsh helped with the heavy lifting his retirement, giving him time to do work he found meaningful. The community that Garrett had terrorized began to heal, and Brandon found himself part of it in ways he'd never experienced. He'd spent 18 years as an outsider, a foster kid with no roots, no history, no place that was home. Timber Ridge became home. On a cool evening in October, 1 year after he'd first opened Kenneth's letter, Brandon sat on a wooden bench he'd built overlooking the ridge. The bench was simple, functional, the kind Kenneth would have made. A small plaque was bolted to the backrest. Kenneth Morrison, 1940 to 2016. He protected what he loved. Beside it, smaller plaques for Catherine and Angela, the three people who'd shaped Brandon's life without him knowing it, who'd sacrificed so he could have a chance. He held the photograph from the bunker, the one that had survived years in storage. Himself at 5, Kenneth's hands, steadying him, both of them smiling into sunshine that felt like it belonged to a different world. For 8 years he'd believed his story was about abandonment, about being thrown away by the only person who should have kept him. He'd been wrong about all of it. His story was about protection, about a love so deep it was willing to be misunderstood, about sacrifice that looked like cruelty, because real sacrifice often does. Kenneth had given up everything, his happiness, his grandson's love, his reputation, rather than risk Brandon's life. That wasn't abandonment. That was heroism of the quietest, hardest kind. Brandon pulled out his journal, a leather-bound notebook he'd started keeping. Not a ledger of crimes, but a record of growth. He wrote slowly, thinking through each word. Grandpa, I finally understand. Love isn't always soft words and gentle hands. Sometimes love is hard choices and lonely years. Sometimes love is giving up everything, including being understood, to protect what matters most. You gave me life twice. Once when you raised me, and again when you let me go. I hated you for so long, but there was nothing to forgive. You were a hero, the kind who suffers in silence so others don't have to. Thank you. For the land, for the truth, for loving me enough to let me hate you. I'm not alone anymore. You made sure of that. I love you, Grandpa. I finally got to say it. He closed the journal and watched the sun drop behind the coastal mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The forest around him was alive with evening sounds, crickets and frogs, and the distant call of an owl beginning its hunt. Brandon Walker was 19 years old. He had a trade, a home, a community. He had Margaret and Stephen and Thomas Reed and the slowly growing network of people who'd found strength in each other after Garrett's fall. He was enrolled in online forestry courses, learning how to manage land sustainably, how to protect what Kenneth had died protecting. The past didn't have to be a prison. It could be a blueprint. It could be the solid ground beneath your feet when everything else was shifting. Some people go their whole lives never knowing how much they were loved. Brandon had spent 8 years in that darkness, believing he was unwanted. But the truth had been waiting in a bunker on a worthless piece of land, patient as stone, ready to change everything. Marcus's grandfather had sacrificed everything, including being understood to protect him. How many people in your life have made sacrifices you never knew about? How often do we judge actions without knowing the full story? Sometimes the people who seem the most distant are actually protecting us the most. Brandon's story wasn't unique. Somewhere, someone was being judged unfairly. Someone was making hard choices that looked like cruelty. Someone was protecting another person in ways that wouldn't be understood until years later, if ever. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. This isn't just about Brandon and Kenneth. It's about everyone who's been misunderstood, everyone who's made hard choices to protect what they love, everyone who's had to discover the truth the hard way. Have you ever discovered something that completely changed how you saw your past? Have you ever been judged unfairly for something you had good reasons to do? Share your story in the comments. You're not alone in this. There's a community here of people who understand that truth is worth fighting for, even when it costs everything. This channel is for people who know that some histories need uncovering, that some fights need finishing, and that love, real love, is sometimes willing to be misunderstood forever if it means keeping someone safe. If Brandon's story touched you, hit subscribe. You're part of something bigger than one person's pain. You're part of a community that believes some truths, no matter how buried, will eventually come to light. If you were Brandon, would you have fought back like he did, or taken the money and disappeared? There's no wrong answer. I want to know what you would do. Tell me in the comments. Kenneth Morrison left his grandson more than land. He left a legacy of courage, a lesson that love sometimes looks like sacrifice, and proof that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually break through to the surface. Some histories are worth uncovering. Some fights are worth finishing. And some love is so deep it's willing to be misunderstood. Thank you for listening to Brandon's story.